Hello, my name is Claire Dutch and I'm the Head of Planning at Hogan, Lovells International. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Chris Miele. His name is synonymous with heritage and he is unquestionably one of the country's leading experts in this field. Chris is a senior partner at Montagu Evans, where he heads a large team specialising in planning and heritage matters. Chris has had an illustrious career. He was a principal author of the London View Management Framework. He has acted for developers in promoting many tall buildings. He has also worked on very iconic heritage assets, including the British Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the South Bank Centre and Westminster Abbey. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning.
Right, I'm going to bowl straight in here. I understand that you are of the view that we have simply gone too far in the conservation of heritage assets. Is that correct? And do you see that that's a problem?
Well, we have now this concept of a wider historic environment, or indeed a wider historic landscape. And I explain in the paper why I've concluded there's now no place which is not without some form of heritage interest, and so no place potentially beyond the reach of conservation. I think that presents a problem to policymakers and to local authorities and developers and consultants. And I'm not sure really that this concept is entirely consistent with the objectives of sustainable development or even the government's objectives about using the planning system to drive economic growth and development.
So how do you think we've got here then?
Well, I explain in my paper, in some length actually, the historical background to this, which interestingly starts in academic life in the 1970s and 80s, where new ideas were imported that challenged conventional and traditional notions of cultural value in historical and cultural studies, and produced an idea of heritage which was well beyond traditional boundaries, and where the boundaries between things were blurred, and indeed even the boundaries between disciplines became blurred. The other source of the transfer of these ideas into our practice has come from the World Heritage Movement, which relies on concepts that we will all recognize today from our own policy framework. The World Heritage Movement needed to stitch together heritage assets from cultures at very different stages of economic, political, and social development. And so naturally it relied on transferable concepts, and it had to draw equality across different cultures and countries, which didn't have the same tradition of monumental building that characterizes European culture. Now, these ideas that come from the Academy and also from the World Heritage Movement come into the UK on the election of the new Labour government in 1997. The new Blair agenda was intended to dismantle the traditions of privilege that had characterized 17 years of Conservative government, and heritage was associated with that. The egalitarian discourse that one finds in the academic studies and also in the World Heritage Movement was ready-made to transport into national policy.
So what do you think the role of English heritage was in all of this?
Well, English heritage had an instrumental role. When New Labour came in, it felt its existence was actually under threat. It realized what the new agenda was very quickly and began to produce a series of policy documents that reoriented the way heritage should, or it wanted to understand and describe heritage. And eventually, these ideas found their way into a comprehensive statement of new conservation policy called Conservation Principles from 2010. And we have in this document the whole lexicon of international heritage and new academic studies transposed into a framework ready for porting into national policy. English Heritage knew that government was thinking of combining PPGs 15 and 16 on above-ground heritage and archaeology into a single planning policy statement, which became PPS 5. This presented the opportunity to give policy expression to this wider historic landscape I've described earlier. And so Conservation Principles of 2010 was instrumental in influencing the drafting of this policy, which pretty well reflected all the objectives of English heritage in its new form.
So where are we today as a result of all that?
Yeah. Well, the framework pretty well adopts all of the concepts in PPS 5, but expresses them in very compressed form. And I think that through that compression, a lot of the subtlety was lost in the drafting of the policy. And that has led, as I say in my written paper, to a series of unintended consequences, which have had, I think, a very serious effect on the way we manage the historic environment, and actually introduced a lack of clarity contrary to the objectives of the framework. And there are three areas, I think, that are of particular concern. The first difficulty is the application of this compressed policy across every sort of asset that exists, from ancient monuments to historic high streets to 1960s tower blocks and planned estates. The nature, conservation, and use of these things is so very different that it's hard to see how a single policy can be used effectively to manage them all. The second problem is the introduction of a gradient of harm from substantial to less than substantial, which I explained in my paper introduces a series of illogical outcomes, particularly because this gradient is applied to impacts which are both indirect and direct. And in fact, there's a big difference between an alteration to a historic building and a change to its setting. And finally, the third problem has been validation of the concept of a non-designated heritage asset, which is hard to define and introduces a great deal of risk into the development process.
So the courts have been particularly active in the last few years, Chris. We've seen a whole host of high-profile heritage cases. Do you think they've helped at all, the courts?
Well, I think the courts have been instrumental, really, and essential in clarifying the consequences and the meaning of the policies that have come out of the process of simplification in the framework. They've clarified how much weight you give to heritage impacts in the matter of Barnwell, the relationship between statute and policy in the matter of Mordu, all of which I quote in my paper. And also, and importantly, the meaning of substantial harm, which is one of the pivots in the framework, as against less than substantial harm. And most recently, in just the last couple of months, Lindblom J. in the matter of Williams has given one of the most comprehensive judgments in the Court of Appeal that explains how setting should be dealt with. And he's come down on an interpretation which relies on visual matters mostly. And I think that will be very helpful in putting to one side claims that setting is a matter of understanding and memory. These are all very important judgments, and actually for the first time in many years, for example, of giving expert witness work, that I feel it's necessary to include in my evidence references to lots of court judgments. It shows how important the court's been actually in clarifying policy.
So, Chris, you've got a wealth of expertise in this area. What are your recommendations for redressing the balance?
Well, I think I have to be mindful of the fact that government wants to keep the framework as short and as direct as possible, and I certainly endorse that concept. I think it's possible to deal with some of these points very effectively through some very simple amendments. So for a start, if I had the opportunity to advise government, I would say that any reference to setting should be removed entirely from paragraph 132, and it should be treated in a separate paragraph, explaining the difference between a setting impact and a direct one. I think in relation to paragraph 133, there should be further clarification on the meaning of substantial harm, reflecting the important judgment in the matter of Bedford, namely that setting impacts are unlikely to achieve a high level of harm, and that substantial harm means the almost total removal of heritage interests from an asset. Finally, I would advise government to redraft paragraph 135, which deals with non-designated heritage assets, to manage public expectations where these assets can be altered without the need for planning permission, first. And second, to make clear really that these assets should not be, are of not such importance that they should stand in the way of development which otherwise is sustainable. I think it's interesting that in the question session that followed from my paper, I was asked how I thought the World Heritage Site concept of outstanding universal value could be better reflected in the drafting of the framework. This is a very topical subject because the World Heritage Committee is concerned about the way London and other UK cities is managing their World Heritage Sites. So it would be possible, I think, quite simply to amplify the description of World Heritage Sites in a single paragraph in the framework to make it clear that these enjoy a status far and above the status enjoyed even by a Grade 1 listed building. And I think all of these suggestions I've made would add perhaps no more than 50 or 60 words to the framework if they were drafted carefully.
So small tweaks would make a big difference.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Chris. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.